everybody. I just want to give everyone to give a round of applause for Trooper Sanders for that keynote. So appreciate your comments today. And we are ready to start our next panel. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the mic over to Atia Thurman, who will facilitate this panel.
Good morning. Is it still morning? Yes, it is. It's been a long morning. My name is Atia Thurman. I'm a lecturer with the Brown School and part of various ecosystems here, seeing a lot of colleagues, and just really grateful that you're all here, part of this conversation, and even more grateful to this next panel. So we have a dynamic group of people who are going to talk to us about the power in numbers, innovative grant making, and collaboration for equitable, community-centered data practice. So without further ado, I'm going to let each panelist introduce themselves. And the first prompt, as you're introducing yourself, is to talk to us a little bit about the role and relationship of data in advancing the work that's important to you.
Good morning. Oh, okay, that's really powerful. Good morning. Thank you all so much for having me. My name is Erica Williams. I'm the founder and executive director of A Red Circle, which is a nonprofit organization based in North St. Louis County. And I'm really excited to be on this panel because as a recipient of grant making, data is very important to the work that we do. Not only to show our funders the impact that we're having, but to also help us build our programming. If we know certain things and certain information, then we can actually help us plan and get the right resources intact. One example of that is, when we first started in 2017, one of our first focus areas was to teach about nutrition and eating healthy and doing things of that nature. But then when we actually began to look around and see what healthy food options were available for North County residents, it was not very many. So had we not gotten that information, that data, we would not have been able to build our program up to this point of how our healthy food access work has grown. So that's just one example. I have several more around education and voting and all types of things, but I'll probably share more of those a little bit later.
Good morning. My name is Leah Moser. I am the Director of Planning and Partnerships with Generate Health, and in that role, I help to support project management for Flourish, which is an infant mortality reduction initiative. And so I come into this conversation from the perspective of both a community-based organization that is the recipient of grants, who has funders that we work with, that we are collecting data and sharing data with our funders, but also through our Flourish initiative, we had the opportunity in partnership with one of our funders, Missouri Foundation for Health, to facilitate a community-led investment process. And it was of interest to both the foundation and to our organization to identify ways that we could shift power to communities most impacted by adverse birth outcomes. And we worked to develop a community leaders cabinet who helped to guide and establish priorities for investment. And we built a community review committee that actually took a look at all of our grant applications and used their lived experience to help guide and make decisions about where to invest in priority areas. And A Red Circle was one of our first Flourish grant recipients. And so where we intersect is both an organization that receives grants and one who facilitated a grant-making process, is we have had the opportunity to really reflect on philanthropy and how it is structured in ways that are supportive of community and ways that need to be challenged. And so I'm excited to be here today. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Bridget McDermott Flood, the Executive Director of the Incarnate Word Foundation, which is sponsored by the Sisters of Charity of the Incarnate Word in San Antonio, Texas, except we're here. Our sisters also sponsor Incarnate Word Academy in Normandy and St. Elizabeth's Adult Daycare Center in North St. Louis, which is primarily in North St. Louis, here in St. Louis. I'm kind of an odd choice to be on a panel like this because, as my colleague here and my colleagues in the room would happily tell you, I have spent the past 20 years saying, I don't really believe in evaluations and outcomes and data. To me, data is kind of a tool. It's useful, but it is not the end, be-all and end-all. At our place, we're really much more concerned with things like the story. We're concerned with the intangible human elements, commitment to mission, having a vision. I can't really even articulate what these things are sometimes, but I know it when I see it. And I guess the story I would tell to begin is I think about outcomes and data. And I think about a young woman, Tashana, who was a friend of mine. I was friends with her family. I guess you could say I'm a mentor, but I don't really like that word either. And Tashana was going to the public schools, St. Louis Public Schools. She was at pre-reading, and she was 8 years old. She did not know the first 100 sight words. We spent a year and a half working on the first 100 sight words. She learned 30% of them. I went to Dr. Adams, who was a friend, and said, what should I do? He said, she probably has a learning issue. She probably needs special ed. She needs this, she needs that. I persuaded her mom, don't start yelling, to send her to a charter school, the KIPP school. And actually it was her grandmother. Her mom was incarcerated. And in a year and a half, Tashana advanced 4 reading levels. So she was reading 1 grade behind grade level at that point in time. So if you measured it at that point in time, you would say, this is a success, right? We went from like total failure to a success. Well, then her father's released from prison. She had never met him before. Long story short, she started spending time with him. She was acting out in school. She left the KIPP school, went back to the public school, was regressing. So now we would say failure, right? Well, no. Then she goes to move in with her other grandma, goes to a different school. She's graduated from high school. She's at the community college. So I tell you this story to say that depending on when you measure it, you have failure, you have success. It's arbitrary. So at my place, we're interested in outcomes that are generations down the road. We're interested in outcomes that are 20 and 30 years down the road because people's paths go like this. It doesn't go like this or like this, typically. So that's why I am not a data person. I'm a bit of a fraud here today, but I'm happy to be with all of you. Cassandra.
Good morning. I'm Cassandra Kaufman. I'm the Executive Director of the St. Louis Mental Health Board, also known as MHB. We are a government funder, so a little different than my colleague. We are a special taxing district, which means that in the city of St. Louis, a portion of property taxes create 2 different funds, a community mental health fund and a community children's services fund. And both of those funds are dedicated to improving the lives of city residents in the areas of behavioral health, children's services, and prevention. So that's where our grant making is focused. We come to this conversation kind of in an interesting perspective. About almost 20 years ago, the Mental Health Board really began to focus on outcomes. So there was a big movement among government funders to be outcome focused, some of it a little bit ahead of some of the other areas, I think, in the philanthropic sector. And so they devised all kinds of interesting tools and instruments. And when I came on board at the Mental Health Board about 10 years ago, they were using something called a target track. And I don't know if anybody's ever heard of that, but literally it was this interesting Excel spreadsheet that tracked the difference between people moving through milestones that were pre-established, and it was a very linear model. And I know a lot of the people that received funding from our organization were not in favor of using that document. And so over time, we've kind of moved away from that. And I think the thing that has most dramatically shifted our focus has been the adoption of our most recent strategic plan and our theory of change. And there's a significant focus on behavioral health equity and racial justice. And so one of the things we're really trying to do as a government entity is to put equity at the center. And because we're a government entity, we have some interesting complications. Sometimes everything we do has to be open records, our meetings are open, and so we are beholden to a number of different stakeholders, including taxpayers. So we have some interesting challenges in how we tell the story and we work with our funded partners. But most importantly, we're still interested And is anything actually different for you because you were able to participate in a program that we supported?
Thank you. You all just highlighted so many prevalent challenges, issues, but also tools, resources that are all connected in this ecosystem that connects human services, community-based, social justice, funding, and philanthropy. So I want to revisit some of the topics that you really just surfaced in your introductions. And one of them is actually a little bit of what Bridget highlighted, because Bridget gave us this wonderful narrative. And as humans, we relate to the story. Data is a way to tell a story. Data is a way to measure the human experience. Data tells us something. It can be a powerful tool, and it could be an ally in advancing equity and social justice. But obviously, it doesn't always tell the full story, right? Because it's depending on the data, how we measure it, when we measure it, and whether it's qualitative or quantitative. I want to talk a little bit about balancing that tension between qualitative and quantitative. And for you, what is the connection? What has been the connection between the qualitative and the quantitative? How do you balance that tension? Oftentimes, I think the methodology around data collection really gives us a lot of quantitative information, but the compelling story comes from the qualitative piece. You want to talk a little bit about that, Erica?
Absolutely. So, we are much more into the qualitative data side at a Red Circle than the quantitative, but we do collect numbers and things of that nature. So we collect, how many people come to events, how many people we serve, how many pounds of food we grow. But then we get to talk to residents who, tell us things like they lost weight, or they're now cooking better and doing meal prep because of the food. Or we get to talk to kids who, are actually doing better in school. Yeah, they're reading differently and things of that nature, but they're actually enjoying school more. So those types of things come into play. Oftentimes, when you're trying to report to funders, it's always about how many people you served and this, that, and the other. One thing that's really cool about Flourish, one of the questions that they ask on their evaluations is not just how many people came to your events, but what percentage of people reported that their lives were better because of your events. So that way you can actually take your qualitative stories and say if you have 5 people come to something and 5 of them say that their lives are better, you can say 100% of the people. And so that looks really, really good. So it's a way to also marry the quantitative and the qualitative aspect of the data and still really be true to what you're trying to capture, because you want people's lives to be better. We're not in this work just to, count numbers and all that kind of stuff, because that's not helpful for anyone. But we also want to be able to show that what we're doing matters because, 1, we want to keep getting funding. But 2, we want to make sure that the work that we're doing is moving what they call the needle along so that some of the issues that we're working towards are actually getting resolved.
Great. One of the things I also heard, though, is that recognizing, and this is why we brought this group together, and yes, you do belong here, Bridget. Thank you for your story. But bringing this group together because we want to recognize that funding is a big driver of how we interact with data, and philanthropy has sort of helped to push this use of data in reporting, collection, analysis. Our behaviors around data has largely been driven in the human service sector by funding and the attachment to funding. But I'd love for you to talk about what are the challenges with that? What are some of the barriers that you've experienced in demonstrating value and impact and the connection specifically to funding?
Well, early on, when you're first starting, you don't have numbers. You have ideas, you have plans, you have initiatives. And, just speaking from a perspective of a Black woman leader, it was not easy to just get funding based off that. People want to see results. They want to see that you've actually done some work. They want to see that they can trust me or other Black women with the money that they're providing to do the work. So we had to do a lot of work for free. We just had to just do it and put in our volunteer time. I was a volunteer for the first 2 years of A Red Circle's founding, and then I got paid first year getting, $35,000 a year, something crazy. So anyway, but that's the kind of thing that we have to do because we are in our communities working towards the issues. Oftentimes I hear of other people who are from somewhere else and they have ideas and initiatives and they're gonna, come and help save this community. So they get the multi-year funding because they look like they can actually do it. They are the trusted, they have the look. Whereas people who are in the community, rising up from the grassroots, we don't necessarily get the trust and the funding right away. And so we now have a person who collects data, who collects numbers, who analyzes and does all kinds of stuff, but we're paying him through general operating funds because we can't put on a grant application, who are the people that are going to help you with this? Our data person. That's not the, typical program person. And so those are the challenges that we've come across. We are now 5 years, and we're starting to become a trusted member of the philanthropic community. We're getting bigger funders, larger funders, multi-year funding. But it was a challenge at the beginning. You can't just have an idea and look like me. You have to show that you can actually do it.
I love that you brought that up, Erica, because when we started our grant making through Flourish, one of our grants was a community mobilization and innovation grant. And it was specifically intended to invest in groups just like a Red Circle that had ideas that maybe didn't have any data collected yet. It could have been in a startup phase. And what we understood and what we heard from our community leaders is there are people in community doing really incredible work on the ground, and oftentimes they're volunteering their time. And so we had the opportunity to create this grant, and we tried to remove some of the barriers that typically come along with grant eligibility. So we removed the criteria around a specific budget that you had to have for your organization to qualify. We removed the 501c3 requirement. We said if you're an organization, if you're a group of parents, if you just have a great idea, we want to find a way to work with you, and we can help you partner with a fiscal sponsor. And when we created our evaluation with our grant-funded partners, it was really around the results-based accountability and understanding, what did you do? How much did you do? How well did you do it? And is anyone better off? And we worked with each of our grant partners to find an evaluation plan that was meaningful to them. It wasn't necessarily about what we wanted to learn, what the foundation wanted to learn. We had some alignment around priority areas, but we really wanted to understand from those who received funding what's important for you to know.
That's a great example. Thank you so much. I took lots of notes because you're answering some of the questions we're going to ask later. So remember this, okay? Remember your example. I'd also love to hear on the funding side, though, on the philanthropic side and the grant making side, you also experienced some barriers, though. However, in deciding and determining who gets money and how it's dispersed, and the stakeholders who are involved in that decision making. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. We're a small funder, so we have two pots of money. Some of our money is for larger initiatives. Those initiatives have been generated by the foundation itself, or in partnership with different organizations in the community, but organizations we've worked with for a long time that have a track record of ours with us. But then the other side, where the bulk of our money is in our small grant program. And these are grants that are usually between $5,000 and $10,000, sometimes a little more. But I really hear what you're saying about these barriers, because I think what's happened in philanthropy is that it has become more and more based on a corporate model, accountability, outcomes. How do we know that people are spending our money right? We need to, require all these forms and all this paperwork. And my feeling always is, if I don't trust you enough to give you $5,000 to $10,000, without putting all these caveats and contracts and all this stuff, I shouldn't give you the money in the first place. We tend to fund based on mission. Some of our grants, our smallest agency that ever came to us had a budget of $5,000. I worked with them to get the budget up to $16,000 because I couldn't give them more money than their budget had. And that organization is based in East St. Louis and now operates a peace center. It's the Join Hands program over there. It's led by people in the community. But there are a lot of obstacles just to getting to know people in the community. We have a staff of 2 people. Our work is relational. How do you develop relationships with people all across the region? And the people who have gone to Washington University obviously have an edge because they know how to communicate with people. They have more time because they aren't a lot of times the groups that are started by people who have gone to the Brown School or SLU or UMSL or it's an established agency, so they have several development people who are like attacking me at the grocery store saying, I've got this project. I'm like, who are you? But yeah, the project. I know what you're talking about. But what surprises me is how agencies that are large often don't get their paperwork in on time. They miss deadlines. They come up with rather bizarre excuses at times, like the dog ate my homework on steroids. And then people who are out in the community are calling saying, you know, I'm working on it, I'm trying, I've run into a glitch with getting into your system because my computer isn't playing well with yours because it's old. And they have the ideas, and they have the trust in the community. So a challenge to foundations is, how do we build out those relationships? How do we level the playing field? And the other point I want to make very quickly is the inequity continues. So we have two food pantries. One is a Catholic food pantry. It's the largest food pantry in the city, run at an old Catholic parish. All these retired white people are coming down there working. It's run by nuns. Nuns are incredible people. So they get more and more donations. Everybody loves nuns, right? So they get freezers. They get everything they need. And it's a well-oiled machine. And if a freezer breaks down, they've got a guy. They know a guy. They'll fix it for free. Meanwhile, we have a black minister in North St. Louis, has a food pantry. He can't accept food because his freezer is broken. He doesn't know a guy. He doesn't have all this outpouring of support. He doesn't have all these white people who have resources that they're bringing in. He has the people in his community who also need the food pantry. So a funder looks at this and like, who am I going to fund? Well, I'm going to fund the sustainable place. I'm going to fund this food pantry down on the south side in Dutchtown because, hey, they've got it, right? It's great. Meanwhile, the minister is serving people desperately in need. But the inequity just grows because then the white food pantry gets more and more resources, and the minister is still struggling. And people are like, well, that's not sustainable. Look at that place. I mean, they're barely getting by. You know, the roof has a leak. There's a bucket over there. Why would we fund when we can fund this? So that just makes it harder and harder for groups. And as funders, we have a responsibility to reach out, connect them, which I did. Sister Connie's like, I got a guy. He'll come and fix your freezer. You know, somebody in the audience, I'm going to fund that freezer for you today. Now he's got 2 freezers. We're starting, but even with that, it's still like this.
Well, it's interesting because you just mentioned like resource sharing and collaboration in terms of the human service piece. But I'd like to bring it back to data a little bit because our keynotes talked a lot about data sharing also as a leverage to help catalyze social change. So bringing the conversation a little bit back to data and the use of data and data sharing, I'd also love to hear about, like, because the same way the organizations experience inequity in terms of leadership, resources, and attracting funding, they also experience a similar inequity in terms of collecting data, analyzing it, and reporting it in a way that allows them to continue to demonstrate their value. How do you think we can cultivate greater equity in terms of our relationship with data? Did I stump you? No, I'm just kidding.
You know, it's something that we continue to struggle with, particularly around the equity question. We've done a lot of things over time that I think we feel have moved closer to equity. I mentioned that when I joined the organization about 10 years ago, they were collecting data on a monthly basis. And then we backed it down to a quarterly basis. And then when the pandemic hit, we backed it down to twice a year. And it's amazing that you can still get the same richness of information only collecting it twice a year versus every single month, and what a burden that was on people. And when you talk about equity issues, just the difference in organizations that have paid staff, that collect the data, that can afford systems to enter the data in versus an organization that is more grassroots, where the person who's running the organization is running the programs, and, oh, by the way, please collect these 14 different demographics so that we can justify to, whomever, our funder, the federal government, that the program is being, delivered, or if you're doing evidence-based, heaven forbid, that it's being delivered to fidelity. And so there's this constant tension between the ability to deliver program and deliver it, to fidelity, and be able to collect all of the volumes of data that are needed to justify that. And so we are constantly walking that walk to collect only what we intend to use and how much is enough. And then also finding methods to level that playing field and to find the most common platforms so that people don't have to have software. They need a computer and an Excel spreadsheet. If they can do that, and we will offer training, then we can get pretty much what we need.
I will add to that and say, grant applications can remove the question, how many people did you serve last year? That would be a huge, huge way to address equity. I mean, our first couple of years, we were, like I said, building and planning and investing and just really looking to see what we knew what was needed because, like I said, I'm a member of the North County community, so it wasn't like I had to like research and explore and that type of thing, but it was how do we do it? And so if we start in 2017, we're trying to apply for funding in 2018. There was no service in 2017, but that didn't mean that we weren't working in 2017. So that question, that can be one of the things that's taken off. And then some of the work that we do doesn't necessarily direct directly to a person. Like, we could finally answer that question in 2021 when we started doing more direct service in 2020 because of the pandemic with food and supplies and things of that nature, because we had that one-to-one, so we could say one person, 2 people, 3 people. But if we're trying to like build a garden or grow food, we can't necessarily say we're going to serve, or we served 5 people or 10 people. So it's just a very fuzzy question, and I would be really curious to see how people really answer that, because we even tried to get these little clickers for our farmers market, but then we're talking to people and interacting with the community, so it could be 10 people go past and we're just like, oh, click, 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 click. So, how many people did you serve last year? Is that really a fair and just and equitable question? Doesn't really give funders what they need to see. And if you're not really serving people, but serving a region, if you're doing systemic change work, then you can't really count how many people you serve. So I think taking that question off will make a big difference in grant applications.
Thank you.
I think, again, it goes back to removing some of the barriers, taking some of these questions off of grant applications, but also knowing who you're funding, knowing what's important to them and what they want to know. And like you said, only collecting the data that you think you're going to use. We sat with our grant-funded partners and said, what would success look like to you? What do you want to get out of this experience? And that's valuable for us. And I think that goes a long way toward building trust in community.
Leah just set us up for the next question. She said, trust. I know you didn't even know you're doing this, but I have heard trust in different contexts here. Trust about who we extend our philanthropic dollars to. But also there's this question of trust in and fidelity around the data. And the reality that in some of the communities and the people that you're serving, the collection of data has also been used as surveillance, as a way to create more harm sometimes, or as a tool that is used by one group and that the people who gave the data don't even have access to use for their own benefit. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about balancing the tension between how we collect data in a way that continues to serve the humans and the social service network, and in a way that how do you build that trust with your stakeholders, with your clients and constituents, so that they trust how that data is going to be used.
So I'll start with that. In 2020, at the height of the pandemic, we partnered with a group called STL Mutual Aid, where we became the North County pod to provide basic needs to folks in North County: food, diapers, cleaning supplies, hygiene products. We just needed to know who they were, where they lived, how many people were in the household, the things that we actually needed so that we could, serve people accordingly. Well, we ended up getting some funding from St. Louis County through the CARES Act, and they needed to know race and gender and age and all these different things that if you have a belly, you need food. So we didn't ask all that other stuff. So we had to start calling people and going back. Hi, what's your race? So we could put it on this evaluation form. They were like, why are you asking me this? And so we told them, the funder is asking us this. We really don't care. If you live in North County and you need food, you need food. That's all we needed. But what exactly was St. Louis County? What was the federal government? We don't know. But because they required us to get that information, we had to change our intake form and, add more columns and ask more intrusive type questions. And, just going back to what is the purpose of labels and data? A Red Circle's motto is all blood is red, meaning no matter who you are, all the other, nuances about your life really doesn't matter, because if you need support, service, if you need us to do things in North County, we're going to change it for you. But because of the funders' requirements, we had to start collecting that data. And so I think that's part of the tension. What were they going to use that data for? Did it really matter with the work that we were doing?
Excellent point. I appreciate you sharing that very specific example. And then also on my side of things, as someone who understands that when we collect data about demographics, it helps us to sometimes advance equity, because I'm able to disaggregate data by race or by gender or by these things. I'm wondering what could breed more trust? What could cultivate greater collaboration and trust between all those different stakeholders in this philanthropic ecosystem, right? What are some things that you may have seen that helps to cultivate a greater sense of that trust, so it doesn't feel like a barrier or an imposition, and it doesn't feel like you're collecting information that's not necessary?
Building relationships with people, sitting and listening to people, and authentically doing the things that you say you'll do. In a previous life, I ran a Center for Public Health Promotion in upstate New York at a university there. And, universities have the historical legacy of going into communities and extracting a lot of data from those communities and coming back onto campus and running analyses. And the people who live in those communities may never see those folks again. And over time, that has eroded trust, and communities are very cautious about people coming from institutions, even if you're there with the best of intentions. And so the center that I worked for at that time, we spent at least a year, maybe 2 years, just visiting the community that we wanted to work with. We wanted to understand who the nonprofit partners were that provided services, and we wanted to get to know the people who lived there. And we just showed up. We would have kitchen table talks with people in their homes, and we had no agenda other than we're here and we want to get to know you and understand what's important to you. And that was an opportunity for us to listen and hear what resources those communities needed. And in the work that I do currently with Flourish, I had recently been asked a question from someone about how we really handed over the power to our community leaders to make decisions about the priority areas that we would invest in. And the question that I was asked was, well, did you ever, were you ever suspicious or concerned about what the community said their priorities were? Because maybe it didn't match the quantitative data that we had about that community. And I said, no, these are people who are living this reality every day, and they know best what they need in their community. They have the richest source of data because it's their life, it's their lived experience. We have quantitative data about this community, and that tells us something, but it doesn't tell us the full picture. So listening and taking that time to know people goes a long way to building trust.
Thank you so much, Leah. So I'd like to think a little bit about our keynote speaker talked about a couple things. He said, reset the table. And I feel like you just mentioned these kitchen table talks and building rapport and actually being in deep relationships and establishing that trust. I think he referred to resetting the table also about building interdisciplinary teams. Who do you want at the table around decision making, around data collection? So tell me a little bit about what would be your dream team, both as a funder and as a human service and community centered organization. What would be your data dream, and who would be on that dream team around helping you to use data as a powerful ally?
Well, first it would definitely be people from North County would be on the team. You know, people, because we're in the process now of working to build a grocery store to mitigate the food desert that is plaguing our region. And so we want people who are going to be shopping at the store so that they can give us the information. We want farmers at the table because they know, you know, from a data standpoint, you know, pounds of food and types of foods and the different factors that go into growing good food and all that type of stuff. We want people who are kind of introverted. Like, I need someone who is going to sit and click and not talk to people so that they can actually be the counters and the people just taking all the information in. You know, we need someone who is strong with Excel and those other, you know, data analytical tools. We need someone who's a good listener so who can capture those stories, because those kitchen table talks, you know, this past growing season, we offered a program called Good Food Fridays. So every Friday, people could pull up to our farm. We had a little makeshift farm stand, and they got a bag of produce. And sometimes people got out of their car and they would share stuff with us, or they would go up and tour the farm. Sometimes they would just stay in their car, but they would always share something with us, some type of nugget. And if I'm talking to people, I'm not also capturing, like note-taking what they're saying, but I need someone who's going to be just like listening and taking notes and stuff, capturing those stories, because that's the authenticity. That moves the needle. People got so excited between that and our healthy community market about eating healthier and trying new foods. One, because they could try them risk-free. They didn't have to pay for them. And there was no judgment. Like, if you didn't know how to cook something, we could share with you how to cook it and not make you feel a certain type of way. If you had never seen something like this, we could tell you what it was. Like, this is holiday season, Thanksgiving. A lot of us cook with sage in our dressing, but people have seen sage in the bottle already crushed up. We have fresh sage, and so a lot of people hadn't seen that before. And so being able to share that, so that makes people feel comfortable. So when you have the right people, the right mix at the table, then you can really move the needle, because you get your qualitative with your pounds of food, or your quantitative rather with your pounds of food, and your qualitative with stories of how that food made people feel. The same with education, the same with arts. So all of the work that we do at A Red Circle, we want to capture the right people at the table.
I'd like to go back a little bit and talk not just about the data that you're collecting when somebody actually is receiving funding from you, but how do you set priorities, and talk about needs assessments and the data piece about that. And so we tend to give out money in 3-year cycles, and so before every cycle would open, we'd pay a partner, we'd do a needs assessment. It would be full of data. We'd do key informant interviews. We'd have listening sessions and focus groups, and we would use that to set our funding priorities. One of the things, that we learned is that things don't change that terribly much, in 3 years, 6 years sometimes. But we were looking for a different way to find out from community beyond just a few listening sessions and focus groups. And so we were going to pattern what we were going to do and shift from having static needs assessments to doing a more dynamic process. And so the plan is that in partnership with the St. Louis County Children's Service Fund, we would work with the 2 health departments in St. Louis City and St. Louis County, and they would collect your typical public health data. How many people show up in the ER, presenting with depression, how many children are hospitalized with behavioral health issues, those types of things. And so they would collect that and have epidemiologists that would specialize in that mental health and substance use data. And then together we would work And our focus would be being in community on a regular basis, not just on a periodic basis when we wanted to learn things, but more regularly to establish those relationships ongoing, and to not only ask people, but train up leaders within communities to become representatives of their communities and helping us to form and shape the information that would prioritize what's needed in the community. One of the things I think that was a big learning for me was the last time we did a formal needs assessment pre-pandemic, it was around children's services, and we were doing a focus group, and Vision for Children at Risk was doing community cafes, and they said, well, you can come to our community cafe and you can talk to the community members who come. And so the big question, we had flip charts all over the walls and Post-its and people taking notes, and someone said, what does mental health mean to you? And so I kind of figured people would say, oh, well, you know, it's about depression, or, you know, it's about this or that. And the overwhelming response was built environment. Now, as somebody who's limited to literally funding therapy, substance use, and the answer from community is built environment, and so they probed that a little bit more, and they said, so what do you mean? And people were talking about hope and despair. And, you know, people who lived in communities where there's trash and it doesn't get collected, and there's broken buildings, and there's no playgrounds, and you have to worry about sending your child out to play on the playground, and there's poor lighting, and all of those kinds of things were how they viewed mental health. And so it continues to become a challenge for us because we're limited in where we can invest our money based on state statutes. How do we bridge that gap between what people in community say they need and what we have the ability to provide?
That's important. I mean, as a North County resident, I have been on the, you know, the surveyed side. So I've gone to the focus groups and the listening sessions, and I put my stuff on the wall of what I want to see happening in North County. And so oftentimes, there's also like this kind of gap in the timing of some of these things. Like there's these focus groups and meetings and things will happen, but then they'll come back and say, well, we didn't get the funding, so then we can't do it. And so then that study goes on the shelf. But then the next year, people have ideas, and so they come in and they focus groups and this, that, and the other, and so we say, this is what we want to see. Oh, we didn't get this funding. So then that study goes on the shelf. I mean, I can probably give you like 4 studies that have happened in North County with whether it's streets or Jamestown Mall or just other different things that have happened that, you know, we get surveyed a lot. And so that goes back to focus groups, trust, and just collecting all of the information. So there has to be more alignment with the people who are seeking the information and the people who are funding the projects that this information will help with. If there's more alignment, then, you know, things will actually move forward. And then we can address things like built environment. One piece of built environment is schools and food. And if you can fund those types of things, then that plays into built environment. But you have to be able to have the information and the funding alignment to actually make that happen.
Yeah, I would like to open the floor up, or open questions up for our audience here. And so we have this mic, and we have another mic right there. And if you have a question, also feel free to raise your hand and speak loudly if we call on you. But if there's a question or something that's percolating with you, that's resonating, we invite you to please pose it to the panel. In the meantime, though, I do have a couple others for myself. Okay. So some of the things you're talking about is the needing more alignment, the gap sometimes in what a funder is actually permitted or has the power to fund. And I'd like us to challenge us to think about the creative spaces. I'm thinking about some models, a couple things. I'm thinking about, is there an opportunity for private-public funding to partner and say, okay, here's what we can fund, but the gap, and we're going to actually, instead of the community having to seek the funding, another funder goes to a funder and says, you know what, can we catalyze and work together on a public-private partnership? I don't know if, I think there's models for that. I'd love to hear if you've had any success with that. The other thing I'm just wondering about is I love the model of community health workers, right? Community health workers are people who are in the community living this experience who are actually being the ones to really help to facilitate better health for their neighbors, right? And they go through training and they're paid and compensated. I'm wondering if there's a role for data collection and data scientists to come from within the community. So not that it's always a university, feeling like it's going in and mining a community, but that we're training the way we have citizen scientists, we have citizen data scientists. We're training people from within the community to do this work, but also compensating them. So I'm just wondering if there's these creative models for how we're doing innovative alignment, grant making, and community partnerships.
In terms of community partnerships and funder collaboratives, I mean, Cassandra and I see other colleagues in the room who have been part of those. We've done that quite a bit here in St. Louis. One of the more recent ones I'm thinking about, well, there's so many, but I'm thinking about the Dutchtown Opportunity Coalition for Youth, which has, it's kind of there are large agencies involved. There are 3 main partner large agencies. Then there are a bunch of community organizations that are very small. We have people from housing. We have people from youth initiatives. We have people from the schools. The public school person in charge of truancy, he's there. The woman who's in charge of truancy for the juvenile courts, they're there. So we've got the community partners, but then we have funding partners. So our foundation is there. Some of the other foundations are starting to come in. And each funder can do different things. Like Cassandra can't fund people once they're older than 18. We can fund people until they're 102. So we each can do our piece. We've also managed to get an earmark from the state legislature. That was kind of an interesting thing. We kind of just snuck it in. And it was really easy because while they're fighting about all sorts of kind of ridiculous things, we're just kind of slipping our little thing in. And that was as simple as filling out 4 pieces of paper. There wasn't even a form, and there was no data. We did throw some in, but they didn't say, we need to know all this. So sometimes you just have to kind of go around the edges like that. We're developing partnerships with the city. Lakeisha is the new person who's working with youth. We just met with her the other day. So that's very possible. It takes time, and it also takes trust. Because the funders, we've worked together for a long time. And it also takes listening to the community need. One thing I did learn just now, I had this kind of light bulb go off, on our applications, we're always asking for data. We always ask for what's the need. I could recite these statistics in my sleep. I shouldn't say this to a large group of people, but that's a question on the application I really kind of skim and say, oh, they've got 3 paragraphs, probably good. I know what's going on in North County because I've been there. I've read these statistics. Maybe we could either eliminate that or say, just check a box, I'm meeting this, as opposed to, well, 80% of the people in this area are African Americans, or 20% are Hispanic, and 50% have this. We've seen this. I've seen this for 25 years. And that's just another hurdle for people who don't have ready access to the data. Then you're like, oh gosh, I've got to come up with these statistics. Where am I going to find that? Well, some people have them, some people don't.
So I'll speak to both of those real quick. Lauren is here from a Red Circle. She is actually about to graduate with her community health worker certification. And one of the things that she's going to be working on is a pilot program because we're working with the food, getting the healthy food out, but we want to know what else is needed to help people with their health challenges and their health goals. So she'll be launching that program next year. But back to like the funder, public partner, collaboration. Corporations in this region need to do a lot more, especially corporations that are getting tax increment financing. Any type of tax credit, any type of free state, federal money that they're getting, they need to do a lot more in communities. They need to be funding schools a lot more. I mean, we have our school concerts in the Ferguson-Florissant School District in the cafeteria that was built when I was a student. The same chairs, the same tables. I mean, what data would be needed to provide to them so they can do more funding? There's so much more that needs to be done. Corporations need to step up. They just really need to step up in that public-private partnership model. And they need to invest without strings attached. They need to invest, let us say thank you, but then let us do what we need to do with the money. Because we know what our communities need. We know what our residents need. I am a resident of North County. I will keep saying that. And you don't have to say, this is what I'm going to fund, this is what I'm interested in funding. You should say, I have the funding. Whatever you need to fund, here it is. That's what needs to happen.
Atia, I have a question from our online people, if I can ask. So I'm going to bring in two questions at once and kind of wrap it together. One is from Wendy, and she's asking, there's a really fine line between needing to have demographic information and being accountable to your board or your funder, and then also asking questions that, sometimes you need that some demographic information. And she's asking, how do you decide the appropriate questions to ask? And then another person also said that data is the foundation of research, and a lot of times we use it for policy. So how can we make sure that our data is inclusive of race and ethnicity, language, culture, and gender, and ability, right? There's so many pieces, but still, asking the right questions, the sensitive questions, the questions that we actually need. Very complex questions, but I thought I would pass them on to our panel.
In some of the work that we are doing currently, we have a home visitation collaborative, and we've recently launched a coordinated intake and referral system. And that required a lot of conversation amongst our home visiting partners about the information that they currently collect on their intake forms. And it was, the intent was to create a central pathway for multiple organizations to funnel folks through. And so the conversation needed to be, what are your questions? What are your questions? What are your questions? And where do we synthesize and align? And most importantly, on the consumer end, what is it like being asked these questions? And I think that we were challenged to then go back to our partners and say, well, why is it that you have to ask this question? Is this necessary on an intake form? Is this maybe something that could be asked once someone is enrolled in your program? And really getting clear on what was the baseline minimum of what we needed to know, and then testing that with consumers who have been through this process before around what it's like to be asked questions.
Really appreciate the question, because as someone who's in the ecosystems of policy and research, there are a lot of questions and data that we need and would like for for equity, for actually around equity, right? But I'm wondering if the disconnection is between how we intend to use the information and that not being conveyed to the people from whom the information is collected. I'm just wondering, do you have scenarios in which you collect data and that there's some conversation about how it will be used and why it's important? I'm just remembering a long time ago as a student, and we were being trained to do census work, right? And getting communities ready for the census. And a lot of people say, I don't want to answer that. And then us going, the reason you want to answer that is because it's tied to funding. It's because it's tied to policy. It's because if we know more about what's happening here, there's more that can be invested in this community. But it's not always clear. Is that something, what does that look like to make it more clear, to make it where the people who are having the lived experience, that they have some agency over not only what they share, but they have some real understanding about how it's going to be used?
I think the thing that would help with that is that back to your census example. Hang on, I'm running out of water. Back to your census example, communities have been done wrong, for lack of a more intellectual way to put that. And I think over time, between government and people in particular, trust has been eroded. And there needs to be some type of a mitigation. People need to see, okay, you're saying that me answering this is going to be helping to tie it to funding, but if I answer this and nothing's changed, there's no investment in my community, this playground is still the same, I drove down Natural Bridge on the way here today, and there's a building that used to be a boat shop when I was a kid. That building is still there with the old boat logo. Like, you're saying do this, and it's tied to funding, and we've been answering questions over the years, but nothing has changed. We have not seen the dollars. We have not seen whatever you're saying this is going to help. So there needs to be some proof, like put your money where your mouth is type proof. Don't just say, trust us, we'll do it, but do it, and then maybe we'll trust you.
I want to kind of shift the conversation just a little bit. I think one of the things that it's not only what Erica has shared and Leah has shared, but there's some education that needs to be done. And when you and to that virtual, I guess, participants' question when they're talking about boards, you know, people sometimes from the corporate sector, people from different sectors who actually govern and make the decisions about the funding say, if you can't measure it, it didn't happen. And so there's this very strong tension between wanting to do what the community wants and needs and the people often that are in control ultimately of the funding and what they say should be measured and what they feel actually demonstrates that something occurred. And I think one of the keys to that is not only education, but getting people into leadership roles that are from community and that have lived experience, so that they can sit across the table from someone else and say, well, here's my perspective from my community, you know, here's why those questions are offensive or why people are hesitant to respond to those. And here's what you could do to do things differently. And I think that that's something that we've recognized, but sometimes they're big ships to turn and it takes time. And so I really do think that one of the keys is getting people with lived experience from community to talk with groups that hold the power around the funding and try to not only mitigate that power balance, but help them to become educated and understand that there's something other than numbers that can actually tell whether something's different or something actually matters. And if you can make that shift, then you could really set yourself up to value the qualitative over the quantitative or begin to build that level of trust at multiple levels.
So Cassandra, I want to just keep unpacking that a little bit. Some concrete examples, does that look like getting into elected office? Does that look like serving on boards? Does that look like testifying, before the Board of Aldermen? Tell us a little bit more about what that looks like, because I think we have some examples of like people trying to, community members over time saying like, oh, the only way I'm going to change anything is if I become part of the decision-making body. And talk a little bit more about what that looks like and what that influence looks like.
Well, I know there was the best example I can think of there was a grant that was made available. The acronym is RECAST, so I can't tell you what it means, but it's something, it happened after the murder of Michael Brown, and it had to do with building resilience in communities that had experienced trauma and violence. And one of the things that was kind of a foundational approach, the grant was made to the county health department. And what they did was they didn't just go into community and ask people, but they provided opportunities to help develop people that were willing, that wanted to have a place at the table, that wanted to stand and speak on behalf of their community. They provided training and leadership opportunities so that people would feel like they had the tools in their toolbox to kind of move in those different paths and take on different roles to be spokespersons from their community because they had the trust and other people in community saw them as leaders and were willing to have them represent them. And that was something that I thought was really, really unique. Instead of just asking people, let's give something back and provide opportunities and ways and paths to help people figure out where they'd like to be.
One other way that people can, not necessarily run for office, but join boards and commissions, but the people who are like the deciding people for the boards and commissions need to open it up to more people in the community because, I've tried. Aside that's beside the point. But there's like application and there's resume needed, and it's like, what are you looking for? If I want to volunteer my time on this board or commission, just let me volunteer my time.
I feel like a theme, a lot of one of the themes I heard was about removing barriers, and you said it in so many different ways. Removing barriers, creating greater access, facilitating more transparency and more access. And then that is a way for us to make the system more equitable. And so are there any more questions from our virtual? Okay, does anyone else have a question? Don't be shy, come on, we spent the whole, yes.
I'm hearing a lot of the fact that data isn't always helpful in the way that it's currently being gathered, which I certainly appreciate. And I certainly acknowledge that it makes up a fragment of a picture or a story. However, I'm a believer in data uncovering patterns to a certain extent. So I'm curious, what are the facts, figures, data sets, statistics that should be collected instead? Because, like I said, I do find it to be informative to a certain extent and a necessary piece of the story, albeit even if it's a small one.
I rely on, I know this sounds crazy, but the census, because the census is a comprehensive data set that, everybody has access to. And I also get a lot of data off of Twitter. I follow these demographers and data analysts who do a lot of data work about the city of St. Louis County, our region. A lot of times they do maps. These are people who are transportation planners, urban planners, a lot of urban planners. And one statistic and a map, they did a scatter map that showed that the majority of African Americans down in the city of St. Louis live south of the Delmar Divide. That was kind of startling news to me. That has some policy ramifications. But I follow these people who do mapping, and by and large, they're urban planners, which is my background. So that's where I get my data, on Twitter. Maybe not so much now with Elon Musk being in charge, but we'll see.
For us, we are focused on maternal and infant health outcomes. And so being able to look at those outcomes disaggregated by race is really important data for us. We have a data hub that we launched recently, and my former colleague in the back of the room, Sarah Kennedy, was instrumental in pulling all of that together. And we pulled a lot of publicly available data. There is so much data out there that exists. And it was not necessary for us to go out and collect data. We simply synthesized information that was already available. That's what really excites me about data, is that you can synthesize things and really learn a lot from piecing together different pieces of data. But it's also incredibly important for us to have the qualitative data of people's experiences. And that in many ways helps to inform us about what quantitative data we should be looking at.
One of the ways that we use data in our healthy food access work, one year I had an intern do like a sweeping map of like all of the food spaces in North County. We have 12 zip codes that we focus on. And so this person went through and looked at all of the fast food grocery stores, convenience grocery stores, or fast food stores, convenience stores, grocery stores, specialty stores, like ice cream shops, that type of thing. And being able to have that on a map really helps us tell a powerful story about, there's this many residents in North County, but only this many grocery stores, and the grocery stores are only here, and so all of these people are without grocery stores. That type of data is what's really helps us drive our work, because like I said, we're trying to do bigger systemic change work. Getting into the, every piece of data about you individually, that becomes more intrusive, and it makes people not want to work with you because they're just figuring that you're only working with them for the numbers. When you go into communities and you ask different questions, okay, so why are you using this? But if I'm looking for regional data, that's what really helps us tell the story that I can tell funders, or actually have to do a pitch competition in a couple of weeks. I know, right? I'm excited. And so I'll get to say, things like, this percentage of people have access to a grocery store, or grocery stores are this many miles away from this many people. So that's the pieces of data that really make it worthwhile, not just getting into people's own personal lives.
I've got an interesting story. It was probably a big wake-up moment for me when I really didn't know what to do after years and years in the field. So we had done a needs assessment. It had actually been done by some colleagues at Washington University, so we had some great data, but we felt like we were really kind of missing the community piece. So we planned a number of community meetings to take the data out into the communities and say, does what the data say resonate with your personal experience? And so we did a community meeting. We kind of tacked on to another meeting that was happening, and they met at a police precinct in North City. And so we shared the findings from the data, and the folks in the audience got angry. And they felt like we were coming into their community and labeling them. And their experience was, there was some statistic in particular, we thought that the data actually said, well, hey, there's disparities in your community, and that will be a way that data can, or funding can be focused and resources can come into your community, and people began to get hostile. And they said, those aren't the problems, that's not true. And one person in the middle of the meeting is sitting back there on their phone, and they call a friend who works for the state. And so some of the data had come from the state, and they got confirmation in the minute from the person that worked for the state that, yeah, that was the data. And the only thing that I think stopped people from really getting even more upset was the person from the community could stand up and validate and say, look, folks, here's my friend on the phone, she works for the state, and this is actually the data. So, let's focus a little bit less on if this is what it is, but that's not how you feel it is. That's the point I think that is so important, is the difference between what people perceive to be the issue and what the data actually says, and how do you reconcile those differences?
I think that's interesting too. I feel like in coming from a social work perspective, I've been in those spaces where people were like, the number that you're measuring, the thing you're measuring is such an incomplete picture of our life and our experience. And oftentimes it comes from a deficit-based, or it's showing disparities, and it's not at all focusing on the strengths and the assets. And I can fully understand, as someone who grew up in North City, why I would feel angry and say, but at the same time, I think that goes back to analysis, interpretation. I appreciate that, like, community-centered data practice is saying this is something we measured, now let's get the full story from the community. But also maybe the missing pieces there too. Lessons learned was who presented that information, how was it interpreted, and was it missing the strengths perspective also? So I think there's some great lessons we're talking about in how to make it community-centered data practice, right? Is it the data we need? Will the data drive the decision-making around funding or policy? Who got to collect the data? Who has access to the data? How was the data interpreted? I think all of these are great questions for how we approach community-centered data practice. Anything else from the audience before?
Atia, we got one over here.
Great.
Hi, I'm wondering what you all think, if there's maybe a trend among funders to move away from the emphasis on data and evaluation. And what I've read is that, the reason that like smaller local funders rely on it is it goes to the federal government in putting out these huge grants that are data-driven by analyses and program evaluation. And then that created a whole body of professionals that are program evaluation people that, I love that stuff. But then they were working for the federal government, and then how can we have more jobs for these people? Oh, well, let's have them work for private funders and foundation people. So then, and our boards then think, oh, well, that's the best way to do it. That's the best judge of effectiveness and who we should fund. And it kind of spins between I think the original is the federal government and academia. And, sorry, don't kill me. But anyway, I just wondering if funders, if you all think that maybe there's a kind of a trend away from that, except Bridget, who's totally rogue, and she acknowledged that, so.
Well, actually, I would say that I was on a call about 8 months ago with, I'm going to say there were 7 or 8 funders on the call, and we all kind of basically agreed asking people for these outcomes really wasn't getting at what the story was. And so I know at least our foundation and 1 or 2 more kind of ditched the whole give us the percentage, like everybody always has 90% or above, let's face it, on all their outcomes. If it's 85, it's like, whoa. So we've ditched that, and what we did is we interviewed each grantee in the spring, and that was our evaluation. And I do think there's a difference between federal grants and local grants. The government is a totally different animal. There's a different level of accountability and everything else with taxpayers and policymakers and the legislature and all that kind of stuff. That's totally different. But for funders like myself, who are small and local, we can do whatever we want. And so we just talked with everybody, and that was our evaluation this year.
I'd like to be Bridget when I grow up. I wish we could do whatever we want, and I think that, that is a luxury perhaps of family foundations or private funders. For us government folks, and I can't speak to the federal government, but we, are a government funder, we also have federal grants. So we sit on the side of the fence of the organizations that are doing the implementation work, charged with collecting all of the data, and, we're not actually out there doing the services, but we're re-granting the information or the funding to other organizations. And the shift with government would be huge. If you think about funding, and I see one of my colleagues that works with homeless service data in the room, everything spins on the data for our homeless services. And it's the key to how much money comes into our community to serve people experiencing homelessness. There's a lot of information that's collected. It's all collected in the same system. And it tells us a lot of information, but it is so important and so difficult for people to collect and still, deliver the services. And so, if we could shift the federal government, that would really be great. And that's, again, that nexus between academia and federal funding. The big dollars tend to come with the big strings. And so it's always a bit of a challenge to figure out how to translate that at a local level.
I'll say real quick, one thing that I think would help with the funding and just kind of marrying the funding and the service world is if people really understood the ratio between the efforts that are needed to actually do one unit of service, whatever that unit of service is. I go back to Lauren again because she's currently working with MFH to help do Medicaid expansion enrollments. And so she's hosting clinics and hosting appointments and doing work on social media and all that type of stuff. She'll do all that, and then, finally that first person. And so, if the funder was like, how many people, if from this point it's one person, it's probably more now, but, it doesn't happen overnight. It's not something that's just instantaneous. And the work that's needed to get to that 1 or that 5 or that 10, something that needs to be captured so that people understand the effort, the work that's needed to, I'm kind of getting off track here, but what I'm trying to say is the effort that it takes to recognize that one unit of service doesn't always get captured by the data.
There's a responsibility too, if you are within a community-based organization and you write grants, to build relationship with your funders so that you know when and how you can challenge. We had some conversation in planning this call, and those of us who write grants, we write grants and we get good at writing grants because we want to get funded. And so we write grants and they look great because those are the proposals that get funded. And we might say, yeah, we're we're going to achieve these outcomes, and we're going to do these new initiatives, and we're going to get it done in a year. And to a funder, that seems really desirable. Like, oh, they can do that? That sounds great. But I think, within organizations, we have to be realistic too, and we have to push back about what we can do and have those conversations with our funders to say, this is what quality looks like, and this is what success would look like.
Atia, do we have time for one more? Yes. Two more. Okay. I have one over here and then one over there. Okay.
Hello, and first of all, thank you to all of our guests here. Eric, I want to touch on something that you said, and maybe it's a question best answered by funders, although the program work that I do is not, the evaluation I do is not for funding. It's for, I work in a curriculum, inserting curriculum within existing higher education programs, so showing the impact. And specifically, you were talking, Erica, about a map, like a heat map almost, or like the visualization of data. And I'm curious about if we're going to move away from data, thinking about, I guess, the way that I feel the concept of data has been described at this point is like facts and figures and numbers, and there's not much story there, there's not much richness there, but what is the direction, if we're going to continue using data, to visualize it in a way that is impactful, that tells a story, but you're still providing the data? And is there a barrier, if we're moving in that direction, for some of the smaller organizations that maybe don't have those even more expensive visualization programs like, Tableau or something, or would require even more training? So I'm curious if there's a balance somewhere in between that, or if there's opportunity, or for the recipients of funding, like how that feels to present, how your impact has been measured by visualizing the data instead of just presenting it in numbers.
I think that's a great opportunity for collaboration. Small orgs, partnering with larger orgs who have the resources and the data and things of that nature. Now, that's kind of a two-way street, because sometimes larger orgs are like, we don't need to collaborate with y'all. So they have to be willing to collaborate with the smaller orgs.
Yeah, I think that's exciting to think about. Data visualization is it's a new way of us to show data and for us to engage with data and understand it. And even when you were describing having an intern, I think, so you had an intern, maybe a Brown School practicum student, I've got practicum students there, who maybe helped to map this and then turn it into something that was a story. And I'm even remembering years ago when the Clark Fox Family Foundation created all those ecosystems around St. Louis, mapping assets and the service providers. But it takes a skill set. It takes capacity. Oftentimes, I don't think that funding comes, I don't think a lot of funding goes to like your operational budget, and that sounds like an operational budget. So I am wondering about some of the innovative grant making and collaboration being, we're going to fund data visualization and data scientists for several organizations, like collaboration where I may not need a full-time, but I've got 5 organizations here who are very similar, who are working in a specific geographic area to help eliminate disparities around education and health. And maybe a funder says, I'm going to fund a data team for all 5 of those nonprofits.
I love it.
Right?
Love it.
All right, I'm just saying, this is what we're thinking about, right? Because, this is where everything's headed. Who hasn't fallen in love with an infographic or one of New York Times' amazing new, data storytelling tools? So I think that that's what we mean a little bit, maybe by that innovative collaboration and creating equity too, because that's a skill set. Yeah.
That sounds great. I'm with a small not-for-profit called Housing Community Solutions Collaborative, works on catalytic projects. I'm real interested to hear, we've hired 7 Brown School people to work at a small organization one at a time. Bridget, you talked about the gap in equity. I was out of the room, and I don't know if that was really addressed. I'd love to hear how you'd break down the gap in the haves and the have-nots, and then have Leah and Erica also speak to that issue. I think that's really one of the critical issues here.
Oh, yeah. Well, just briefly, I was talking about how a white food pantry and a black food pantry. The white food pantry had a lot of, yeah, so I talked. Well, I think how you break down that gap is by getting to know people and not using the criteria of long-term sustainability as your be-all and end-all, because you're taking a chance, right? I mean, I think of the organization I funded in East St. Louis with the budget of $4,000. I mean, that sounds crazy. But that organization had been working with volunteers for over 20 years before they decided to get funding. And now the housing authority over there actually gave them a building for a peace center, and the neighborhood uses it as a community hub. But was it sustainable? No, it wasn't. So I think sustainability is something that you have to kind of take with a grain of salt. So that's how I would answer that.
With our Community Mobilization and Innovation Grant, we worked to provide support for individuals who were interested in applying to that funding, and we made grant writing support available. We had folks who were interested in the grant opportunity and said, I've never written a grant before. And even though we had developed an application that we had hoped would be really straightforward and simple and remove some of the, the barriers to applying, folks, there were still people that were freaked out, and they were like, it's a grant, I have to have data, I have to tell you what my numbers are. And so, we wanted to move away from that, and we said, we have support here for you, someone to just talk you through. If you only have an idea, sit down with these folks, and you can talk about your idea, and they can align that with our grant application and help it make sense. We also had a community review committee, and these were folks that represented the communities that we wanted to shift investment to, and they made the decisions. So we held the process. We brought the review committee together. We made sure that they had the tools to make good decisions, and we let them make decisions. And it was not our role in that to say, ooh, but we've heard good things about this organization, or we know, a lot of the organizations who applied, we didn't know anything about them at all. But our review committee members said, oh, I know this person. They are an anchor in their community. They have been doing this work on the ground for 30 years, and we trust them. So it was really shifting over that decision-making power to folks who were in community.
Erica, could you add anything to that?
No, I'll just say real quick, it's definitely the innovation and collaboration and cooperation that's needed. I mean, to your specific example about the food pantry situation, one thing that we can try to break the gap is to look at the big picture and try to provide opportunities that provide equity for people so that we can reduce the need for food pantries. But that's a whole nother panel conversation.
Do we have one last? Okay, going once, going twice. Okay.
Hi, I'm Matt Feldman. You hear it? Okay. Sounds the same to me. I'm with Goshen Education Consulting, and I also happen to be the president of the Evaluation Association of St. Louis, so this whole program evaluation conversation seems really interesting to me. The only thing I would say in defense of program evaluation is that good program evaluation is local evaluation that works directly with funders just like you and with organizations. And so evaluation that occurs somewhere else and is for other people, that's probably not good evaluation. But the work that we do and that we encourage our evaluators to do is work that's local and has direct impact with folks just like you. So that's my little defense in our conversation today.
I think we are data. Data is everywhere. It's always, our own lives, our entire life story, the experiences we're having, information, education. I grew up on the Matrix, so sometimes I look and everything is ones and zeros, right? But there's all of us are having the human experience, and we are here to also improve that experience and to make it more equitable, to remove so many of the historical disparities that have accumulated over time so that people are having the experiences that they also deserve as human beings. And all of you are in the space of improving social systems, improving that system. And data has a real role. It can be an ally and a leverage point. It can tell a story. It can catalyze. It can deepen relationships. It's the information we exchange, and it has value. And in 2022, data is one of the most important currencies of our digital age and our time. I would love for you to end today with talking to us just a little bit about, like, what's the last thing you'd like to leave us with, but also how can data be a greater ally in the work that you're doing. And I would also venture to say that I want to thank DSSI and Social Policy Institute, because I think they're in the space of trying to innovate data-centered data practice and make it something that is accessible, create a set of practices and standards that we can say, that's data-centered, and we want to do that. But your lasting thoughts for us.
So I will end with saying that we should not let data drive the programming, but we should let the need and the community drive the programming and use data to enhance the direction of it.
What she said. Yeah, you know, it's when I think about the work that we're doing at Generate Health, and we think about the number of babies that are lost in our region each year, like, that is data, but it is also people's lives. That is a child that was lost by a family, and that ripples out through our community. It's not just that individual loss, it's a family loss, it's a community loss. And without the stories and the richness of people's experiences, you know, we can't work towards solutions with just numbers. There's a lot more data.
I would emphasize something that you shared, which is that we need to not lead with all the negative data in community and tell people how bad they are, how poor off they are, how they're disadvantaged, they're at risk, they're this, they're that. But look at the strengths of community and the resiliency of people and start measuring positives. When I talk about Dutchtown, where our housing project is, the St. Joseph Housing Initiative, people will continually say, oh gosh, Dutchtown, the crime, the this, that. I'm like, Dutchtown is a wonderful neighborhood. It's a lovely place. There are wonderful people there. I never, ever talk about all the negatives because the media is busy doing that for me every day, and it beats people down. So emphasize the positive, and let's start collecting positive data and go from a strength-based perspective.
Earlier you asked kind of what was the one thing that you'd like to see happen. And I think that there's a big difference between collecting data and evaluation. So, you know, if I had all of the money, or our organization had all the money, it would be really helpful if we could have someone work hand in hand with all the organizations and do things like process evaluation and use pieces of information to truly improve program. But we don't have enough money to do that, so we end up collecting some basic data. You know, and so there's value to both, and so I wouldn't want people to think that there's not great importance in the value of collecting data. I think it's really about how it's collected and what it's used for.
Please join me in thanking our panel. Thank you so much. Such a dynamic conversation. And now Jen Rose is going to lead us into our next. Thank you. Such a dynamic conversation.